And let me once again officially welcome everybody to today's webinar, Combating Human Trafficking in the United States. Before we turn things over to our moderator, I'd like to turn things over for a brief statement from Christina Bain, who leads the project on human trafficking and modern-day slavery at the Carr Center. Christina.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, everyone, for joining today. I just want to thank Jim Cooney, our conference administrator today, who you just heard from, for his dedication to this online conference series. He's actually leaving Harvard this week, and he's going to be going on to graduate school, and we're so happy for him. So, Jim, thank you so much for your commitment to this issue and for putting on this best practices series with us. In addition, I also want to thank Karen McLaughlin, who was so instrumental in helping me put together this online conference today, and all of my other colleagues who have spent the last 48 hours emailing out to their listservs and getting the word out on, again, such short notice for this online conference. Thank you for your dedication to this issue, and thank you for your work in the field. And with that, I want to introduce Jeff Gulati, our conference moderator.
Thank you, Christina. So it's been about 10 years since the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. While this was not the first federal initiative, it was the most far-reaching effort and marked a major milestone in the federal government's fight against human trafficking and modern-day slavery. Since that time, starting with Texas and Washington in 2003, 46 states in the District of Columbia have signed legislation to address the problem of trafficking into law. Most recently, Ohio and South Dakota passed laws just this year. Many new initiatives are being debated in legislatures across the country, and states are constantly reevaluating their approach and specific policies and programs. So that leads to a series of new questions. How are recent initiatives and the four-paradigm approach to combating human trafficking working in practice? Which specific policies and programs are working well? Which ones are not working well? I hope in the future where this will lead is that we start to develop some more formal methods for evaluating the effectiveness of recent laws, policies, and programs. But first things first, today we have three guests who are on the front lines in the fight against human trafficking and real leaders in the areas in which they're working. They're here to offer their insights onto what's working well in practice, what are some of the challenges that they're facing, and how they're dealing with the issue. Before I introduce our first panelist, I just want to again remind you that you can send in questions at any time. Let me now introduce our first panelist, Kevin Koliner, who is an Assistant United States Attorney for the District of South Dakota. He has prosecuted a number of human trafficking cases, including both sex trafficking and labor trafficking cases. He is a frequent lecturer on trafficking, has made a number of presentations to the Department of Justice, their nationwide programs on trafficking. He's also been to Jordan to help judges, prosecutors, and investigators implement recently enacted legislation on trafficking. So with that, I turn it over to Kevin Koliner.
Well, thanks very much, Jeff, and thanks all of you for joining us for this webinar and listening in on this topic. It's one that's near and dear to my heart, so I appreciate that so many of you have decided to join in on such short notice. I have been asked to talk about the best practices in terms of investigating and prosecuting a sex trafficking case. So I need to start with a bit of an apology, which is that I don't pretend that these are the best practices. These are what I have done in a recent sex trafficking case. They may not be better than most practices, but they were effective in this one particular case. So as I go through, I'll talk about what we did, what was effective, and I'll try to tell you a little bit about what I think didn't work, what we could have done better in hindsight. My first slide here is the rhetorical question that you probably all know the answer to already. Is it happening here? And I have my home state of South Dakota. the place where I imagine most people don't think a crime of this magnitude happens. And, of course, I'm here to tell you that wherever you are, if there are impoverished, vulnerable people, there are likely those out there looking to exploit them, and there is probably trafficking happening in your area. I live and work in the town of Sioux Falls. Here, I use my little pointer here, which is right over here in this part of the state. I prosecuted a labor trafficking case that centered around Chamberlain, South Dakota, involving a number of Filipino immigrants brought over. The sex trafficking case I'm going to talk about centered around Sioux Falls, but it also involved Minnesota and Iowa. There is a state prosecution going on right now of a prostitution case in Rapid City. I recently indicted a sex trafficking case that occurred on the Standing Rock Reservation up here in the Mobridge area. That's to say, just in my sparsely populated state alone, I have some very recent examples that it is, in fact, happening here, and that is meant to mean wherever you are. So the case I'm going to talk about, and by the way, we've been told to take between maybe 5 and 7 minutes to give this sort of opening remarks. I hope that our questions and answer session at the end is a robust session where we can answer all sorts of particular questions. I'm going to go very quickly and sort of summarize what was a very lengthy and complicated case. So I'll do my best to do it quickly with the caveat that this is probably about an hour or maybe two worth of information crammed into a few minutes. So the case that I'm going to talk about is United States v. Brandon Thompson. You see the happy couple there on your screens. This is Brandon Thompson and his former girlfriend, Megan Hayes. The two were co-defendants in the case of U.S. v. Brandon Thompson et al. Mr. Thompson is a man from Chicago who turned out blew his way through Chicago, then through Wisconsin, then Minneapolis, then North Dakota, and finally found his way to T, South Dakota, a idyllic bedroom community of about 4,000 people just south of Sioux Falls. He left outstanding warrants and various aliases at each stop along the way, and in fact was living in T, South Dakota under an alias of Terrence Clay. Mr. Clay was a real person. It was actually one of his cousins whom Brandon Thompson had stolen his ID. How does a case like this begin in a state like South Dakota, and how do we line up an investigation? What I'm showing you here is a highly redacted document, but this was a report from a juvenile detention facility. And you see a date on this report up here in spring of 2009. And what we had was a young woman, and the redactions are because I've redacted out any information identifying any of these victims. She came to report to one of the workers at this juvenile detention facility that she had been involved in a sex ring, and she went on to describe very ambiguously this sex ring, and her participation in it was even more ambiguous. What she refers to and referred to with this worker was that she claimed she had a friend who was involved in this ring, and she was concerned about her friend's involvement. This is kind of what led off the investigation in terms of the initial information. I have this slide up now talking about generally how the case was investigated. When this sort of information came in, it came in with one additional thing, and that was just a couple months later, there was a report. This is from the T Police Department. A woman was sitting in her vehicle outside of Brandon Thompson's home, and when the police officer pulled up beside her and asked her, why are you sitting in your car here on a residential street, she said, I have a daughter who has friends who've been involved in a sex trafficking ring, and this is where the guy lives, and I'm sort of doing my own citizen surveillance. This led to the assignment of several very good state and local agents that became involved as lead case agents on my case. What did they do initially? They started doing some surveillance of the house. They did checks of these various police reports. We had the one police report that I just showed you. What they also discovered was a police report involving this man, Brandon Thompson, under his alias, where he, in fact, himself had called into the police department asking if there was an outstanding traffic warrant for him. He apparently got a ticket, and of course was worried that there'd be a bench warrant issued because he didn't want to be fingerprinted and have all these warrants from other states discovered. So he had called in himself. That particular report, through very good police work, led to a floodgate of additional information. And I'll talk about that in a minute here. We subpoenaed phone records. We did search warrants of various homes, various cars, and a number of email accounts. These cases are made on interviews, and we'll talk a little more here in a moment about things to keep in mind when interviewing, especially victims in these cases. There were a number of electronic records, and what I mean by electronic records are phone records, internet records, various records from social networking sites, emails, things of that nature. We did a lot of public record searches, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but what I mean by that is just Google searches, things that are readily accessible by anyone. And finally, in a certain aspect of the case, we ended up wiring up a confidential informant. One thing we're talking about today is a victim-centered approach. Who are the victims in a case like this? Well, this case ultimately involved approximately 20 victims that were identified by law enforcement. Within the pleadings, we ultimately made a decision to only bring charges related to victims who had been identified and interviewed by law enforcement. In the end, there were 13 different victims, a variety of different charges. All of these victims were vulnerable, many of them vulnerable in the same ways. In getting to know them, many instances of sexual abuse, many were rape victims, substance abuse problems, chronic runaways, especially with the juvenile victims. Some had previous histories of prostitution, severe poverty in every single case, and a lot of emotional, mental instability and problems at school. The story that we heard repeatedly from, I would say, just as a thumbnail estimate, about half of the victims went something like this. I was 14, 15, 16 years old. I got pregnant. I was living with my mother. My mother kicked me out of the house. I decided I wanted to keep the child. I had nowhere to go. I knew if I went for public assistance, my new child would be taken away by Child Protective Services. So I was left without options, and that's when I met this man that I knew as Gaddafi, was an alias that he was using with all the girls. And he promised me all these things. By the way, I've been victimized by every adult male I've ever encountered in my entire life, so I figured this time I'd get paid for it. That was a refrain we heard, sadly enough, time and time again from the victims in my case. They all had the same concerns, and again, this is not rocket science, but it bears noting. These are the concerns that we have to keep in mind when we're dealing with victims of this crime. They are all embarrassed about what they've done. At the very heart of it, of course, you have often very young people coming in and being asked to talk about sexual experiences with a group of adult investigators. And it's embarrassing no matter what the circumstances, but especially here. They're very worried about their reputation, what it'll mean to their friends, what it'll mean to their families, what it'll mean to their employers. They're very worried about their own possibility of being charged criminally. Many of these young women have been through the criminal justice system before, and for one reason or another, they have learned to distrust law enforcement. And so regardless of the number of times that we tried to assure them that they were victims and not perpetrators, they remained very concerned about criminal charges throughout. And then, of course, they were worried about retribution from the instigator, from, in this case, Brandon Thompson. What we learned from these girls is that Thompson engaged in a pattern with each of these girls that was roughly the same each time. He would meet the girls. He would quickly convince them to either have sex with him, oftentimes coerced sex. He would take photographs of them that he would tell them that he was using to send to potential customers. He would then bring them around and prostitute them out to various customers that responded to online ads. We learned that many of these girls were threatened with a handgun. Many of them Some of them were beaten, many of them were raped. Those who were not physically harmed were often made fully aware of the physical harm that had occurred to other girls. Again, all these sorts of physical threats that were involved. One of the most difficult things in a case of this nature is keeping track of the victims. I would often tell the defense lawyer when he'd call me trying to convince me that I didn't have a very good case, he'd say, well, how many girls do you think will show up for trial? And I would tell him the same, I guess, sad joke, which is, well, on any given day, I could have 10 girls here present. They might be a different 10 girls each day. And that was the reality of the case, is that many of these girls have transient lifestyles, transient living conditions. So, these are just some tips that I have that worked for us. We were very vigilant about maintaining constant communication. When I say we, the credit really goes to a victim witness specialist with the FBI who worked constantly with these girls, constantly communicating with them, oftentimes about things completely different from what we were concerned about in the case. Personal concerns, problems they were having with friends and boyfriends. She became their confidant. We would visit the victims in person, and the final point here is building trust, and that's sort of the general point here. Many different situations where these girls, of course, got into this situation in part because they had nowhere else to turn and no one to turn to, so it became necessary in gaining their trust to be that person there for them when we were needed. Maintaining confidentiality is, of course, crucial in cases like this. Now, the first point on this slide, refer to victims anonymously in court filings. I hope that goes without saying to any prosecutors. But I also tried to go a step further in terms of my dealings in public proceedings when victims were present. I would make special arrangements with the court to, for instance, if there was a wait before a hearing, for them to open up, say, a jury room so we could wait in that room rather than waiting in a public hallway. I went to the press that showed up to various hearings directly and asked just a personal favor that they be very vigilant in protecting anonymity in case there were any quotes that may have that they may want to use that may have identified victims or other witnesses. So, back to the investigation, what we discovered and how it was discovered. We received this police report. From that police report, we found other police reports, and those police reports included, as I described earlier, this call that was made by Brandon Thompson under the name Terrence Clay asking about a warrant. That report had in itself a telephone number that he had used to call in. We then used that telephone number, another open record search, and we just Google searched the number, and we found a number of ads that had been placed by someone using that number trying to sell a car on Craigslist. Going through all of those ads on Craigslist, we found finally, near the end, one ad in which the contact number on the ad was, call me at this number or try this other number. And it had a second phone number. An open record search of that second number, that revealed a landslide of prostitution ads. So we knew at that point that the information we'd received from these initial reports was at least initially corroborated. Then we started to subpoena phone records. And again, a lot of this just took good old-fashioned police work of matching up information to records. But what we ultimately were able to discover is that Mr. Thompson was using phones that he would throw away about every 2 weeks. The one constant was the phone that was being used by his live-in girlfriend. It was a work cell phone that she had issued to her. We then subpoenaed the toll records for that phone, and from that phone, the records for that phone became sort of a secret decoder ring for all of the phones that Mr. Thompson was using because we could see frequent calls to various Chicago phone numbers where the number would change approximately every 2 weeks. So we knew then our universe of phone numbers. I'm going to show you, this is a piece of evidence that we compiled using some analytic software. So what do you get when you get all these phone records together? Well, you can make some determinations about just how many times phone calls are being made to different people. There's a name here on some of these, which is a guy named Joshua Payer. He was a doctor in Sioux Falls that I also prosecuted in sort of an ancillary case for sex trafficking involved in this ring. As you can see here, what we discovered in analyzing the two phone numbers, or 4 phone numbers in this case, 5 phone numbers, is that there were a certain number here that Mr. Payer called Mr. Thompson 817 times over a course of time. Here Thompson called Payer back 571 times. That's just one number. This is very good evidence in terms of corroborating an association between 2 players in a case. And so, in my view, cell phones and the prevalent use of cell phones has become just a critical piece of evidence for so many investigations of this sort. We used grand jury subpoenas to get other information. This is an example of a motel receipt that we received via a grand jury subpoena. And there you see at the top, there's the name, Terrence Clay. That was the alias of Brandon Thompson. And we have a date when a room was checked out. Piecing this together with phone records, and then along with information that we received from the many victims in their interviews, a picture started to emerge. And that picture was that over time, and with the right pieces of evidence, and with the right interview information, we were able to sort of piece together each and every day of Mr. Thompson's life over the course of a couple-year period. I mentioned before that we also got email information, and that, again, gave us all sorts of information about his whereabouts and what he was doing. I'm going to try to go quickly here, show you a couple of other pieces of information. This is one of these scandalous ads. This is from Backpage.com, which is the group that many of you probably know about. They sort of picked up where Craigslist supposedly left off. It's essentially the same as Craigslist. There are many blacked out portions of these pictures here. That's because those are some of our juvenile victims. This is an example of some of the ads. Just like Craigslist, if you're familiar with that, you can click on this and responses, then you can reply up there. If you were to do that, then you can send an email to an email address, which turned out to be Mr. Thompson's, one of many emails accounts that he had. We got those emails, and we were able to tell, when these ads were placed, how they got the pictures for him. Mr. Thompson was arrested. He had on him a standard Blackberry, I think it was a Blackberry Storm phone. Inside of the phone, there was a 2 gigabyte memory card, and using a federal search warrant, we were able to get into that card and have it forensically analyzed. There were thousands of pictures on his phone, many of them excellent pieces of evidence. This picture in particular is important because this car is about a $100,000 BMW owned by Dr. Joshua Payer, one of the ancillary defendants in the case. This young lady walking in is a 16-year-old girl, one of Thompson's victims. The little piece of yellow that you can see right there is Payer's 2000, I think it's a 2009 or 2008 Lamborghini. And, of course, there's his address. This is what we in the business call evidence. This is another photo from the phone. Again, just pictures of random pictures of cash. One thing we had heard from many of the victims is that Thompson flashed a small caliber silver white-handled handgun. And we'd heard this from a number of people, but we were never able to find the gun. But in his phone, we found this photograph. Again, a perfect piece of evidence matching up some of the stories we'd heard to a face in this particular instance. So what were his charges? He was ultimately charged with 26 different counts. You'll note here near the end, there was a count of solicitation to murder federal witnesses. I mentioned before that we wired up some in the course of this. At one point, when he was detained awaiting trial, we learned from his cellmate that he was trying to hire his cellmate to kill two of our witnesses, two of our victims. So we wired up the cellmate, and we wound up getting about, I think, 4 to 6 hours of very explicit details and conversations with Thompson and the cellmate about his plans to kill two of these girls. Ultimately, Mr. Thompson was offered a plea agreement, and the plea agreement was that he would be required to plead to the two most serious charges in the case, one count of sex trafficking of a child by force, and secondly to a count of one of the solicitation to murder a witness counts. As we approached trial, it seemed as though that was an agreement that no one would take in their right mind because he was still susceptible to a life sentence. Ultimately, I think, based on just the power and the amount of the evidence that the agents were able to find in this case and the power of the testimony of these many victims, he took the plea agreement. He went into sentencing hoping that the judge would accept a recommendation of 30 years. She did not accept it, and he was sentenced to life in prison on April 15th, 2011, along with a 10-year consecutive term for the solicitation to murder a witness. So a life term plus 10 years consecutive. That's a very quick run-through. In fact, I took longer than I should have on the U.S. v. Brandon Thompson case. I'm more than happy to answer any questions about it, but at this point I'll turn it back over to Jeff to introduce the next panelist.
Thank you, Kevin. And let me just say to our audience that we will be answering your questions. We're getting them in right now, and we're going through them, and we'll just wait till all three guests have presented, and then we will pass the questions on to the various presenters. Next, we have Sergeant Chris Bray, who is a long-standing veteran of the Phoenix Police Department. He spent a number of years as an investigative supervisor in the Organized Crime and Drug Enforcement Bureau. He has been an expert consultant for an instructor on human trafficking for the Arizona Peace Officers Standard and Training Board, and also assisted the state of California on similar training programs. He also represents law enforcement officers working to end the buying of commercial sex on the National Steering Committee for Demand Abolition. That's a program of Hunt Alternatives Fund, which is located right here in Massachusetts. So I'll turn it over to Sergeant Bray.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to address the folks, members of this web seminar. And this does involve a commitment. As we go through this, you're going to see that this has changed and evolved. Some basics for you. Fire science. No offense to my brothers in the firefighting industry, but fuel, heat, oxygen, you've got a fire. If you reduce any of those components, you minimize the fire. Remove any of those three components and the fire goes out. Commercial sexual exploitation is completely different. You have the production side, the supply side, and the demand side all coming together to do sex trafficking. And while a reduction in any one component, you think like fire, it will cause the problem to diminish. Well, not quite. It actually causes the other side to compensate for the to maintain profitability, because as any of the traffickers will tell you, it is all about the money. Rule number one in the game is the pimp will get paid. So, for example, if your local law enforcement agency runs a supply side operation, meaning they're doing street sweeps, and you will have providers, prostituted people that are arrested, well, demand will remain the same because that aspect has not been addressed. Production, meaning the pimps and traffickers, will be out there definitely trying to bring in more business to make up for that, and supply will increase to a static level to meet demand. If you are to reduce the production and supply side of this equation, however, demand remains the same, well, now you are inviting other people as they see the profitability for those few components that, or those few individuals that remain in the business. They're making more money because, all right, basic supply and demand here. When supply goes down and demand stays constant, cost of the product will go up. They see more people making money, or those few people that remain making money, and therefore they're going to become involved in it. So the problem then is, well, what do we do? Much like a water-filled balloon, if you squeeze one side or two sides, the bulge comes out on the other side, and you really don't solve the problem. By taking steps to reduce all three components with serious emphasis on the demand side, that's when you're going to cause a downward spiral in the activity. And we'll talk more about the demand side of the equation here in just a bit. But let's go back to Einstein's definition. Doing the same thing over and again and expecting different results being the definition of insanity. What law enforcement has done forever was to go after the supply side in a minor way and go after the supply side in a major way, and to go after the production side in a minor way, and completely ignore the demand side of this equation. Obviously a problem. Now, law of unintended consequences attaches to this. And when we looked at just attacking the supply side of this equation, we had perverse effects completely contrary to the original intent, which means the providers, the suppliers were out there bringing in more victims, and the demand side, customers, were victimizing those people even further by increasing their activity. Negative effects are the expected or unexpected detriment are more common. As we attacked the supply side, the production side, we found that it rose to the level of demand. When you allow demand to stay constant, supply and production will rise to the level to meet that demand. So when we were looking at this in our task force model, victim-centered approach is first and foremost in our thoughts. As the slide indicates, we have found that we need to involve some non-traditional folks in our task force. Obviously, the victim, what do? Well, job one is locate. You use outreach. We have church groups, school groups. We have non-governmental organizations. We have concerned citizens that are passing out information, going to the street, contacting people that look like they may be involved in the sex industry. Absolutely incredible amount of non-governmental groups, some organized, some not so organized, that are stepping up to reach out into the community and try to help the victims that are out there and are plying their trade. What we're seeing with information coming from a variety of sources. The Polaris Project, the NCMEC, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. There are some excellent agencies out there that are funneling information to us. And once again, you've got to go and look for the problem before you will find it. So proactive investigations. That means that our investigators, our detectives, are constantly searching our regular sources of information, SIPSAP, Backpage, Eros. There are a ton of resources out there that are being used by the supply side, by the production side, to advertise. It's all about the product. Now, after you have done your best to locate, next comes the rescue. Now, the rescue can be established by an escape by the victim. First responder may locate a victim out on the street or through contact. First responders also include firefighters, who are members of our task force. The firefighters bring a rather unique perspective and organizational skills to our group. The Arizona State University and some of the attorneys and master students have brought together some unique abilities to this in the outreach, in first responder, and assisting with reactive investigations. Information comes to us. arrested for another crime, however they come to us. Well, now we've got the victim coming to us instead of us finding the victim. Lastly, we want to stabilize, and we have members of the task force specifically tasked with that stabilization process, meaning we have advocates. We have people that can provide the medical, the mental, the decompression time, so that that victim can aid in their curing their healing. Mentoring is a fairly recent addition to our task force. It's not just enough that you find the victim, that you rescue the victim, that you prosecute the other parties involved in this. You've got to be able to provide some kind of healing for that victim. That's where the mentoring program comes in. It has been our experience that some of the best mentors are actually survivors. They have the ability to relate to these victims on a very unique level and are therefore able to have the built-in credibility with the victim that's going to help them get better. Second part of the victim-centered approach requires that the task force de-incentivizes this whole sex trafficking thing. We don't want anyone to gain from the exploitation of the vulnerable. So there's education, non-traditional outreach, going out into the schools. We have found that there is a common misperception in many communities that prostitution is a victimless crime, that it is somehow okay, and that's just not the case. In the 11 years that I've been involved in these sex trafficking crimes and in the investigation, we have had almost 30 women and one man in the Phoenix area that have been killed while they were engaged. So the secondary effects, the drug addictions, the risk to life and limb requires intervention. So education, publicity, yeah, we have found that publicity can be our friend in these cases, if for no other reason than to provide some deterrence. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in just a bit. And enforcement, demand reduction. Yes, we are actively going at the demand side of this equation. RICO statutes, for those that racketeering, influence, corrupt organizations, what RICO stands for. And we have found that the best way to actually discourage the conduct is to go after the pimps, go after the production side, and take everything they have gained through this horrible process. Model laws, the Arizona state law is very similar to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and its penalties and its wording. We have some excellent laws here, and we have prosecutors as part of our task force, both federal and state prosecutors, that take a very vital role in looking at the model laws, proposing them, what can we do to change them. We are a very unique group in that everybody gets to provide information. Egos are pretty much left at the door, and we are actually able to accomplish some amazing things. Demand reduction is one of the key points of this because it directly addresses the main component of sex trafficking. And this is actually more of a holistic response to this issue. You have got to go after all facets of this, but the demand reduction, in my opinion, and from what I've gathered from others, is one of the key components because without the demand, the supply will dry up. When the supply dries up, the productivity side will dry up. I will say that the demand reduction component has either been ignored or tolerated by communities of all sizes. I have yet to go into a community, even the small ones, and not be able to find an ad someplace for an escort or erotic massage. It's everywhere. It's not just South Dakota. It's not just Phoenix. It's the small towns. We've got victims that are being recruited in some of our very small towns. And it just amazes me that these victims are being sought out, being found, and being directed into this horrible, horrible business. Deterrent value is directly dependent on the perceived likelihood of apprehension. Okay, what that requires is commitment. That means that the folks that are involved in these operations have to be absolutely committed to doing it the right way, going after those suspects wherever they are, the demand, the hobbyist, the monger, whatever you want to call them. But it definitely requires that there be no safe haven from where they can operate. When we engage in these customer apprehension programs or demand reduction efforts, we routinely have undercover police officers out on the street posing as prostituted people. We advertise on the Internet at all of the sites. We go into the hotels not only as to check the hotel, the bars, properties, but we also put our operations out of the hotels. We base them the same places where those victims are being abused. So it's absolutely critical that you go everywhere. And part of this commitment requires not only the wherewithal to prosecute from your prosecutorial agencies, it also requires some true commitment from your agency, because there is a large chance that somebody high profile will be apprehended. Public perception and awareness so that those people that do engage in this conduct realize that, yeah, law enforcement is out there looking. They are actively looking for victims as well as those that would victimize them. Part of those operations where we are out on the street or on the Internet or in the hotel, my undercover officers, my decoys, will have the traffickers approach them and try to recruit them. And that's where things get even more interesting. Phoenix has, within the last 6 years, prosecuted approximately 100 pimps, and we've got a 90+% conviction rate. We are very pleased. The average sentence right now is approximately 9 years. I think one of the most important aspects of demand reduction is closure for the victim. Many times those images that they had on the Internet are out there forever. The people that victimize them, it's not just about the pimp. It's about that John that continued to provide a market, continued to pay them, continued to keep them out there. And knowing that the agency, the officers, the investigators that they're working with are actually going after those people that kept them held captive from the standpoint that they provided the market that caused that pimp to keep them out there, knowing that there is punishment for them, that we are actually, somebody pays attention, somebody cares. It's just a huge issue for providing some kind of closure for that victim. Lastly, I'm happy to help in any way that I can. This is my contact information, and if there are any questions that you can't get a hold of me during this webinar, please feel free to contact me, and I will certainly answer what questions I can and provide what resources I can. Thank you very much, and Jeff, I will turn this back to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next guest is Norma Ramos, longstanding public interest attorney and social justice activist. She currently is serving as the executive director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, which is one of the world's first. It's one of the first organizations to be in the fight against human trafficking internationally. Now in its 22nd year, so you can see well before the passage of the TVPA in 2000. Most recently, she and her organization led a demonstration co-sponsored with 85 other organizations to demonstrate against Craigslist and to put pressure on them to close down their adult services section last year. I'll turn it over to Norma.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this webinar. We have just heard from two very inspired law enforcement officials who are clearly doing law enforcement from a whole new understanding of how human trafficking is unfolding. And what they've just outlined, their strategies and their tactics, actually need to be reproduced all over the country. Given what we've just heard from them, I think I'd like to talk about something that we really don't spend enough time on. which is the larger social conditions that are making human trafficking, particularly sex trafficking, possible. And I'd like to talk about the creation of the demand, because we at the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women do not believe that it is a given that men and boys are born into the world to want to buy commercial sex, to want to have sex under some of the most incredibly abusive and destructive conditions. Basically, what we've learned through some wonderful research, some very critical research coming out of the world's leading expert on prostitution, Dr. Melissa Farley of Prostitution Research and Education, is that when men buy sex, they are basically buying domination. They are basically buying the right to abuse another human being through the vehicle of sex. And so we need to start asking some of the hard questions that we're not really asking enough of in this movement, which is, why do we have such an incredibly large demand for commercial sex? What is leading men to the sex industry? And I think we have to look at a number of cofactors. And one of them is the pornography industry, which is socializing male sexuality in incredibly destructive terms. And what we've learned by books such as the first book, I think, written in the entire world ever about the Johns by Victor Malarick, is that men are seeking to have the sex that they see in pornography through prostitution. So I think we have to look at the way our culture is normalizing prostitution, the way our culture is giving social acceptance to men and boys, to look at women and girls as commodities, sexual commodities that can be bought and sold for use and abuse. And it's wonderful to hear how law enforcement is addressing the prosecution side of this, but we have really got to be in the business of the prevention side. Not that because prosecution is prevention as well, no question about that, but we have got to start taking on the social construction of our culture that is socializing men in this direction, men and boys. And we need to look at, for instance, I'll just look at one piece of this, which is, you know, the TV industry, HBO. The Coalition Against Trafficking in Women has had a campaign that we have waged against HBO's show Cat House, which calls itself a docudrama, but wasn't documentary, but what in fact it has become a huge vehicle to normalize, to glamorize prostitution, which is the end result of sex trafficking. And we did hold a demonstration 2 years ago in front of their headquarters where Ambassador, and I'd like to thank him again for that role he played during his leadership as the leader of the GTIP office, and he stood out there with us in front of HBO's headquarters here in Manhattan while we protested this show. And we called upon HBO to put resources into telling the truth about human trafficking and sex trafficking and the sex industry rather than put resources into glamorizing it. And so we need to start looking at the social forces that are giving rise to sex trafficking and human trafficking, and we need to become creative, and we need to engage in corporate partnerships that can help us do that. There's a group, ECPAC, that has had a campaign to get hotels to play a role in being vigilant about not letting sex trafficking unfold in take place in their hotels. They have a whole pledge campaign. So there are many organizations out here that are beginning to rethink and come up with creative ways about how to create the social, political, and legal conditions that will no longer be hospitable to human trafficking. And so one of the things that the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women has done, for instance, our partners in the Philippines, is that they run boys camps that begins to challenge in a very fundamental way definitions of masculinity that are premised on gender inequality and the whole sense that men have a right to get sexual pleasure at any cost through essentially the destruction of their sisters. We also have programs throughout Latin America through the funding of the GTIP office, programs where we are running the same kind of format of teaching young boys not to consume prostitution and to actually challenge all kinds of gender stereotypes, which is very critical to do. So what was very interesting to me during this discussion was to hear this wonderful U.S. Attorney, Kevin Koliner, and Sergeant Chris Bray actually talk a little bit about the social conditions. I heard Kevin talk about that conditions of poverty, of course, exacerbate this, that wherever there are vulnerable populations, we are going to have this unless we act to stop it. And we need to think about making sure we do not support social policies that remove safety nets. We don't want to see the removal or policies that will reduce financial support to poor people, such as food stamps and public assistance. We have got to make sure in these very stressful economic times that we do not support policies that increase poverty. We want to support policies, we at the Coalition Against Trafficking Women, that address the growing income inequality that is unfolding in the United States. There have been some very important articles written in the New York Times by Bob Herbert and Paul Krugman that are very clear about this growing and give important statistics about the growing income inequality in the country that is rendering more and more of our population vulnerable to both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And so these are all things that we want to think about. We want to think about initiatives that will directly lead to a sex trafficking-free internet. CATW, along with PRE, Prostitution Research and Education, co-led that demonstration. We took the demonstration right in front of Craigslist headquarters in San Francisco with the support of wonderful organizations like Equality Now and ECPAC and Zonta International. We had speakers like Victor Malarick and Aaron Cohen. Male leadership, it's very important. Abolitionist male leadership is critical to this fight. And we want to make sure that Craigslist was a huge problem because this was a mainstream organization that was steadily becoming a sex industry-based company. And we want to work towards a sex trafficking-free internet. And so we are going to take on Backpage, and we are going to go after Eros, and we need to do that with a broad-based coalition. And so I know that there's been a lot said, and we're reaching the point where we need to hear from the listeners. So I want to end on the thought of that we have had a lot of conscious raising around human trafficking. And one of the concerns I have about our movement is that we spend a lot of time in endless analysis, and I want to urge our movement to remember the words of the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who said, "Power concedes nothing without demand." We must become a very demanding movement, and in his words, agitate, agitate, agitate. Because we could have endless discussions and engage in the paralysis of analysis and only have incremental change when what it is going to take to end human trafficking is quantum thinking and quantum principled action where we reject this notion of a false divide between child sex trafficking and adult sex trafficking, when we know that in fact child sex trafficking and adult sex trafficking are inextricably linked, because if an adult can be sold, a child surely will be sold, because in fact it is adults who keep children safe. So we have to reject these false notions of adult versus sex trafficking, and we do have to address what I consider gender-based discrimination, which is nationwide, which is this uneven enforcement of arresting the prostituted women and girls and giving the Johns. Of course, we have our illustrious former Governor Spitzer being the best example of that, where the buyers not only don't get arrested, but they get rewarded with a show on CNN. So we have tremendous gender-based discrimination throughout this nation. I'm in contact with a number of law firms where I'm asking them to look at a class action-based lawsuit that can be brought against this uneven enforcement against the prostituted and giving the Johns a free pass. There's a recent piece on the net where a Knoxville city official was told by a judge, was given basically a free pass, was allowed to escape any serious prosecution. And this goes on in every state, and we have to see this through the lens that it's actually unfolding, which is gender discrimination. So we need to be creative, we need to be principled, and we need to act.
Thank you very much, Norma, and thank you, everybody, and thank you all our listeners out there who have been sending in questions. I know now you're ready to, I'll start to ask some of those questions, and we can get some responses from our panelists. We've been getting a couple of questions from people about labor trafficking. We have spent a lot of time on sex trafficking, and I think there's acknowledgement out there that labor trafficking is also an issue. Wondering if, Kevin, if you might be able to talk about that because you've prosecuted some labor trafficking cases. And then maybe Sergeant Bray can jump in as well, because we had a question about the new immigration law, recent immigration law in Arizona, and what impact, if any, if that's had on addressing labor trafficking cases.
Well, sure. Kevin Koliner here. I prosecuted a case that began in about 2007, United States v. Farrell, that resulted in jury convictions of 2 hotel owners in South Dakota. Ultimately went up to the 8th Circuit and was affirmed on appeal. That was a case where they had brought over a group of about a dozen workers from the Philippines. One of the defendants, Angelita Farrell, is herself from the Philippines, and so some of these individuals were like distant relatives and friends of her family in the Philippines, and they were caused to work under slave conditions in it was a Comfort Inn and Suites, a very modern interstate side hotel in the middle of South Dakota. The investigation ultimately showed that these workers, when I talk about slave-like conditions, we had one worker who just her time clock entry showed that in 1 week she had logged, I believe, 130 hours in a week's time, which is, incredible if you do the math and realize that a week's time has just over that many hours. It was a case that where these folks were exploited through a number of different coercive mechanisms. The similarities, I think, are more than the dissimilarities when you're comparing labor trafficking to sex trafficking. Similarities between those two sorts of cases include impoverished, vulnerable communities. Oftentimes, I think in labor trafficking, I believe it's fair to say that the victims are oftentimes foreign nationals, whether they're brought in illegally or legally, who are brought into this country and enslaved in part because their legal status, their legal standing in this country is precarious to begin with. And one of the elements in the federal statute regarding labor trafficking deals with legal coercion. And what that often is the common threat, which is if you want to go to the authorities, I'm going to turn you into to ICE and you're going to get deported. You're going to get charged with a crime. Very similar use of threats of the legal system. Of course, prostitutes are often threatened with the same sorts of things. You want to go to the authorities? Well, I have nude pictures of you and I know all these things that you've done that have been illegal, so go ahead. In my case, there were threats of violence, and there were lots of sort of coercive tactics that were used. the result is often the same, which is one human being treating another human being like they're an animal, like they're a commodity. And so, again, I think the similarities are more than the dissimilarities.
Dr. Bray, do you want to add to that?
Okay. Well, from the Arizona aspect, 1070 was signed into law last year. I've been involved in the human trafficking issue since 2000. And we actually became a task force member under the TVPA in 2005. So I've got about 5 years prior to the law being enacted on which to base this. What we have seen time and time again is the financial aspect that comes into this. And I really hate to keep putting it, these are people we're talking about, but the reason they're being exploited, that they're being forced into slavery, the reason that they're being sexually abused, et cetera, is for somebody to make a profit off of them. That's the bottom line. Somebody's making money off of these people's misery. So when you look at it from the Arizona standpoint, Arizona is, because of its proximity to the border and the access, we are much more of a pass-through state. By that I mean, if I can make the analogy for a quarter pound of marijuana, it's going to cost you about $250 in Phoenix and Tucson. You take that same quarter pound of marijuana and move it out to Omaha, and it's going to run you about $1,200. Okay, so the short version is the closer the product is to the source, the less expensive it's going to be. You keep demand consistent, move that product further away, it becomes more valuable. So in many cases, as far as Arizona labor trafficking is, because of the labor pool here, because that money is going to be less than if I take that product further away from the border, we're not seeing the labor trafficking like we first expected. And we have taken measures where we've divided the city up into grids. We've done grid searches of those businesses that have historically shown a high likelihood of propensity for labor trafficking. We have followed the workers home. We have counted the number of workers at the business, the number of workers' vehicles in the parking lot. Those groups that may have roomed together, they were followed to various stores and seen making individual purchases, having their own cell phones, having contact outside the group. They are a very tough case to prosecute, especially if that victim doesn't want to disclose to you exactly what happened. And some of the organized crime elements that are involved in human trafficking are extremely vicious, and with the threat of injury, death to family members or themselves, very reluctant to disclose to us. So there's a lot of factors in the Arizona area that, while we haven't found a lot of trafficking cases that rise to the level of criminality, we have found numerous cases where there has been an abusive employer, and those cases have been turned over to the Department of Labor Hour and Wage Division for their investigation.
Okay, thank you. Next question, Norma, if you could take this. We've got a question from Anna about what is being done to change legislation criminalizing acts of prostitution committed by juveniles. And it seems, her feeling is that it seems like the girls are victims and they shouldn't be held criminally liable for that. So have there been recent laws, changing state laws to treat young women or young girls as victims rather than as criminals? And I just want to add to that is it's also up to the discretion for many prosecutors, or even if there's not a state law, that a number of the prosecutors can use their discretion not to prosecute. Have you seen that as a widespread practice, or where are we on that?
Before I answer that, I just wanted to add something about the last question, the labor question, labor trafficking. First of all, I wanted to point out that we have found at CATW that there isn't such a clear-cut divide between labor trafficking and sex trafficking. We have found that in many instances of labor trafficking, you can have the same victim who has been labor trafficked is also sex trafficked. So we need to be clear about that. And the strategies around ending labor trafficking are actually very well tested and very clear, but they are not being enforced strongly enough. And we would, we support strong initiatives, including increasing penalties against employers who would engage in labor trafficking. To answer the question about the trends in what to do, the laws that address juvenile sex trafficking, in New York, we passed the first bill in the nation through a coalition, by the way, where we took our leadership from a very important organization in the nation, GEMS. Through the leadership of survivors, we were part of a coalition, and we passed the first law in the nation that treats prostituted youth as sex trafficking victims. That bill was known as the Safe Harbor Act, and that bill is now, and it's a diversion program to take those arrested for prostitution, to divert them away from the criminal justice system into social services. Obviously, there are not enough social services in place anywhere in the country, but that is the premise of that legislation. And that approach is being looked at in a number of states, including Chicago. There's a wonderful group in Chicago, CASE, led by Rachel Derschlag, and they are working on that there. They've just succeeded there. So this is what needs to happen in every state in the nation. But again, this false divide between children and adults, because these children are going to have an 18th birthday, as Dr. Farley always likes to say, and they are more likely going to still be found in prostitution. So again, we need to move away from this false divide between children and adult prostituted human beings. By the way, has anyone noticed we never refer to anyone as a prostitute, because we do not define human beings by that which has been done to them. We don't want to stigmatize these victims.
Thank you. We have a question from Donna about the press and confidentiality. She has a concern about when we have when she's had cases that where private information about the victims will be released by the media, and some of it is identifying information. Can any of you talk to that? And maybe Kevin, since you've prosecuted cases, and how that relationship with the media works and what you do to try to protect victims' privacy and identity?
Sure. I could say here in South Dakota, at least in the cases that I've prosecuted, I've been lucky in that we haven't had that sort of leak. We've certainly had media attention, and we've had lots of stories about these cases, but there haven't been any leaks that I've been at all concerned about. I like to think that part of this is through my efforts. It may just be the good fortune of having good, professional, responsible journalists in my community. But, what have I done to try to ensure that? Well, number one, I've taken great lengths to not identify victims in any court filing. And, if there is, for some reason, a need to identify a victim by initials or date of birth, I've done my best to make sure that we can file redacted versions in the public record, and to seal in the official record anything that has to be unredacted. That takes some vigilance, especially when you have long litigation with lots of filings. But it's something that we just have to prioritize, because it's twofold. Number one, of course, it's to protect the confidentiality of the victims for their sake. Number two, though, it's for the sake of the case, because if you lose their trust, you're going to lose the case. So it's one of those sort of high priority things. Another thing that I've done, I've dealt with the local press before in some of my cases, and I've gone to them directly when they're sitting there in the back of the room before a hearing, and I've gone up to them and I've said, look, I want this to be off the record, but I am going to ask you a personal favor, which is I'm going to have a young lady testify today, and I'm afraid she might say something that even if you print her name, even if you don't print her name, someone may be able to identify her. Would you do me a favor and not quote her? And every time I've done that and just addressed the situation squarely and directly with a reporter, they've agreed to do that, and they've abided by that. So, that's what I've done. It is an excellent question because it's an overarching concern in these cases. Look, it's a good problem to have. It's good that the media is interested in these cases. So it's a problem that I welcome, but it's one that I think that we can deal with effectively.
We've got another question from Lena about, have any of you heard of cases where using Johns as witnesses? We hear a lot about using victims as witnesses against traffickers and against pimps, but have we had any cases? Is this something that might where we might be going, where we're able to use the Johns as witnesses in cases? And I'll leave it open to whoever wants to answer that one.
Well,
but Jeff, go ahead, or I can. Jeff, go ahead.
No, any of you, go ahead and take that question.
Okay, this is Chris Bray from Phoenix. Our experience has been that we have used the quote-unquote John to build a case on the trafficker based on like an activity warrant sort of situation where people leaving the house of prostitution are contacted. We have gone after the John post-arrest of the trafficker based on information that was in a victim's cell phone, information that we've come up from a variety of internet sources. But using the John to testify against the prostituted woman or child, I don't like doing that, and it's just from the standpoint of it's patently unfair.
Kevin Koliner here. It was the question about using the John as a witness against the trafficker or against the prostituted victim. I agree with the comment just made in terms of prosecutions against the victim. I guess my view is that victims shouldn't be prosecuted. I have, in the Thompson case that I described, we identified several Johns, and I use that word sort of loosely. People have different levels of involvement. The individual I talked about, named Joshua Payer, who was prosecuted separately, he was a customer of the ring, and I prosecuted him under the federal statutes. He ultimately struck a deal that involved him participating, cooperating against Brandon Thompson. That is part of the public record, so I can say that out loud. But so there is one example. It certainly, if Johns can be identified and interviewed, it's a very powerful witness to the case. So absolutely, I think there's a lot of cases that involve Johns as witnesses.
Okay. Thank you. Here's a question from Tiffany, and it's partly to you, Kevin, but hopefully, Norma, you can jump in on this as well. She's asking if the U.S. Attorney's Office is working on any best practices for safety issues concerning victims when they are asked to testify. But also she asked about, she's had cases, she's witnessed cases where children have had to testify in front of the pimp and his associates, and so she had some concern about that. If you have anything that you could respond to that, and Norma as well, please.
Well, I'm happy to respond, Norma, if you'd like to go first.
No, go ahead. I think actually this is good for the law enforcement to answer. Go ahead.
Well, again, it's Kevin Koliner here. Absolutely, those are concerns, and they're ones that have to be taken seriously. Of course, a defendant has a right of confrontation, and that's a constitutional right that they're entitled to. And so what does it mean in the end? It means that if there is a trial, and if you want to introduce testimony that is testimony from an individual, direct oral testimony, they're going to have to testify, and they're going to have to do it for the most part in the room with the defendant. So what can you do as law enforcement? Well, you can do your best to make sure that that witness has practiced to the point of their comfort level, that they're made fully aware of the realities of the situation. I kind of make it a practice to never tell a witness something that's untrue, and so I tell them that from the very beginning. You know, look, you know why you're here. This is going to take a lot of courage from you, and I'm going to be asking you a great deal, and I don't have a whole lot to offer you in return except for the hope that you can do something good in the world, and it's going to require that you do this. I mean, that's kind of a speech that it's an uncomfortable speech, but it's one that I've had to make, and I'll tell you, you know, I'm awfully proud of the victims in my case that I spoke about, because at the end of the day, when we went to the sentencing hearing, I had 7 victims who got up and talked, and that was at a sentencing hearing where we didn't need their testimony to convict him. They got up and made very forceful statements to the judge, kind of on their own volition, to say something. So your question also, though, went to how do you protect people? Well, you know, I often tell these victims that when they walk into a federal courtroom, they're in the safest spot in the state of South Dakota. They're surrounded by deputy marshals. They're surrounded by court security officers. They're surrounded by case agents on the case, and they're in full view of a federal judge. I also tell them that if there's anyone nefarious that wants to come and see them testify, chances are those are people that don't want to be in that room. So I've had very little concern ultimately about you know, friends of the trafficker coming in and targeting victims. Now, when we did have threats against the lives of some of our victims, we took very fast action, and we, you know, U.S. attorneys' offices have funds set aside for witness protection. We use some of those funds. We have the ability to move victims anytime that there's a concern about safety. We can move them into a safe place and have them monitored and so forth. And we took some of those precautions in my case as well. So there are a number of things that we can do.
I'd like to add that what you talked about earlier is actually key, which is to do evidence-based prosecutions, to do everything you can in bringing these cases, not to rely on the victims, to actually create your cases, build your cases out of the evidence the way that you talked about, getting the Blackberry of the trafficker, getting all the photos. Here in New York, we have this wonderful prosecutor, Lauren Hirsch, who is doing the same thing, and one of the things that we're talking about is, for instance, when there's busts on brothels, treat the brothel as a crime scene. Gather your evidence that way rather than relying on human beings that have been victimized over and over again, who have very little faith and trust in the system.
If I could just add to that, this is Chris. People, juries, expect you to have the forensic evidence. With the influence of TV, CSI, and some of the other shows, they're expecting a lot of forensic evidence. So, yes, we do crawl into computers, cell phones, records, video from bus stations, video from hotels, fingerprints left or fingerprints put on registration slips at the hotels. There is a variety of evidence that we can gather and use that to build such a case that most of the time our suspects really don't want to risk the huge amount of time that they can face in prison. So when you have somebody that is willing to accept a 35-year plea, basically that means that they don't want to risk all of the time that they could be looking at. And ultimately that's how you take a trafficker out of the loop, is you put them in prison and you put their ill-gotten gains back into trying to do something for the victims and for society. But absolutely paramount to do a good, thorough, forensic evidence type of investigation so that you don't rely on just the word of your victims, because some of them can get frazzled up on the stand. It's understandable.
Okay, thank you. Now we have a question from Lindsay about how can demand reduction efforts be applied to labor trafficking. And again, I'll open up to any of the three of you, since all of you have talked about demand reduction. Any of you who would please feel free to respond to Lindsay's question.
Well, I have to tell you, I mentioned that the strategies around ending labor trafficking there's some very clearly set forth ones. And one of the things we have to do in this country is to support labor unions. We have to support labor unions because when you have a base of organized labor, it's actually going to be workers who are going to be the first ones to know whether or not there are labor practices taking place that meet the definition of labor trafficking. So supporting labor unions, supporting good, solid minimum wage policies. The United States has lost ground on all of these measures that reduce poverty, that increase social justice, that become a basis to achieve gender equality. We've been losing ground. So on labor trafficking, there are some very clear set basic policies that need to be supported. I saw in the New York Times yesterday that the workers at Target are seeking to form labor union. These kinds of initiatives. We have too many people in this country. 17 million children are going to bed hungry a night in this country. These kinds of social policies are increasing the vulnerability we've talked about over and over again during this discussion. And with labor trafficking, one of the key policies is to support unionized labor.
Anybody else like to follow up, or I can go to the next question? Okay. We got a question from Kathy about what role do you see for healthcare providers in combating human trafficking? Maybe Norma, do you want to take try the first response, and then if anybody else wants to jump in about healthcare providers?
Well, I think healthcare providers very often, besides the police, very often, of course, it's the local police officer that's the first to come into contact with a sex trafficking or labor trafficking victim. Healthcare providers need to be trained to understand what they're looking at when they see certain indicia of abuse, and how to, again, same issues, build trust, who to notify, what kind of services could be available. These kinds of very basic things need to be trained. We need nationwide training on this.
Kevin Koliner here. One of my other roles in my office is I do healthcare fraud cases. And one thing that I've been surprised about is how little is known about the law enforcement exceptions to HIPAA among healthcare professionals. And what I mean by that is that, healthcare privacy laws, very important laws, have been so ingrained in trainings with doctors, nurses, healthcare administrators, that the takeaway point that I think too many people in the healthcare world have received is HIPAA means we don't say anything about patients ever to anyone. And there are, within HIPAA, specific exclusions for law enforcement related information. And that's one message that I think needs to be made clearly to healthcare professionals, because I agree with what Norma said. There's information that is going to be learned by healthcare professionals in the course of their work that would be helpful to law enforcement, and those folks need to know that they can give it to us.
This is Chris Bray. One of the first things we did when we started reaching out to people was we contacted area hospitals and spoke with the case management group and the emergency room supervisors. And we gave them a briefing on what to look for, questions you might ask in a very reasonable setting. Just like the simple thing like, well, what if you decide to leave this job? Now, it sounds kind of innocuous, but if the person gives you the look and says, well, I can't leave this job, well, then that's a clue. And we started giving them some training on that. We have some more training scheduled coming up for hospital personnel, but first responders and fire personnel, because they're the ones that are going to show up on the scene of an injury. Tree trimmer falls from a tree. That won't necessarily gather a police response, but it will have paramedics from the fire department there. So cast a little bit broader net when you're talking about first responders. Don't limit it to just police officers. If in your area you have emergency services provided by independent ambulance services, that's another group you're going to want to reach out and touch and let them know what to look for.
Okay. I have another question for someone about if you suspect that a child is a victim of sex trafficking, what should they do? Who can they call? Who can they notify?
Well, for Phoenix, we have mandatory reporting laws here that are in effect. We have several different phone numbers that are out in the community, Catholic Charities being one, of course 911. There's a group in Phoenix right now, Streetlight, Phoenix.org, and they are actually getting into safe house, housing, long-term care, to include occupational care and therapy, equine therapy, art therapy. Just getting the child, once you've located the child, is one thing, but post-care is becoming more of an issue, and there are more groups stepping up, and these groups are also funneling information to us. 1-800-THE-LOST for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children is a good resource. NCMEC, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, their website. There is a lot of, well, all right, let me rephrase that. There are more resources coming online all the time to help with this problem.
Okay, here's a question for directly to Kevin from Lena and Eleanor. How can we improve the federal trafficking law, the TVPA, to make it more effective in prosecuting sex trafficking cases? And they also ask, do you think you could prosecute sex buyers using the obtain provision of the TVPA? So if you could explain what the obtain provision is and if that's something that you could use. And they follow up to say that the DOJ says that these cases are in the pipeline, but they know of only some examples in Missouri, and that's about it.
Yeah, well, what's being referred to there is I know that there were some cases prosecuted out of Missouri that were essentially sting operations, kind of like the television show To Catch a Predator, where they had posted some ads online, and some respondents came to a house that was rigged up with cameras and so forth, and they were arrested there and prosecuted under 18 U.S.C. 1591, which contains as one of the active verbs in the statute that someone can be prosecuted for sex trafficking if they have obtained another person, among other words. So the federal statute has been used to prosecute buyers in that way. My prosecution of the Joshua Payer case was an example where I prosecuted someone using 18 U.S.C. 1591. He ultimately pled to the conspiracy count 1594, but again, that was premised upon the use of some of those more customer-oriented verbs in the statute: obtained, enticed, so on and so forth. As to how the statute can be improved, I guess I have to respectfully sort of balk at that question. I'm a federal prosecutor out in the field, and so what that means is that I gather together any relevant admissible evidence I can and try to apply it to the laws as written. I know the Department of Justice has legislative affairs folks who are professionals at dealing with what the law should say or shouldn't say. I'm one of the guys out here hitting my head against the wall of what the law does say. And so that's, I guess that's my perspective on it. I will say that I have not felt as though the statute as written has limited us in prosecutions. With that said, I'm glad that Sergeant Bray is on the line here today because he's a shining example of how state and local law enforcement can work together with federal law enforcement and task force and elsewhere to deal with the broad spectrum of sex trafficking cases. And so I guess that's my answer to the question, at least as best as I can.
Great. We have another question coming from, this one's from Caleb. He asked, is there a link between sex trafficking and drug trafficking cases, or just the larger issue of drug trafficking? So I'm hoping that the two law enforcement guests could speak to that. But also, Norma, if you could jump in, maybe we want to think of the issue more broadly, since you brought up about underlying conditions, not just drug trafficking, but maybe substance abuse, drug abuse, and how that plays into the issue of sex trafficking.
Well, we have over 400 partners worldwide. The Coalition Against Trafficking Women is the world's leading abolitionist network working to end human trafficking. And what our partners have been telling us about this exact question is that increasingly the drug traffickers are turning to human trafficking as another means for criminal activity and criminal profiteering. And they're using, our partner in Mexico, Teresa Ulloa, has been telling us recently how increasingly the drug traffickers are becoming human traffickers, and they're using the same routes. So we know that there is a growing inextricable link now between human trafficking and drug trafficking. So I think law enforcement needs to start adjusting their enforcement measures to look at that and to think about, again, evidence, the way evidence is going to be collected in some joint prosecutions. And one of the myths, by the way, just related to the second part of what you said is, and what was mentioned earlier, the many myths that surround prostitution. And one of the myths is that women enter prostitution in order to support their drug habits. And what we have learned is that's actually not so much the case, that in fact many of the women become drug addicted as a result of the prostitution. Because as we all know, and from the research that Dr. Farley has done, prostitution is violence against women. It's hugely debasing. It is hugely humiliating. And very often the way that women and girls are able to endure this level of abuse is to numb out through, and the pimps are actually the vehicle, the traffickers are the vehicle of supplying these drugs to the prostituted so that they will be numbed out, so that they can be used over and over again. So there's that link.
Hi, this is Chris, and I would agree that drug trafficking organizations, DTOs, are more and more using human trafficking not only as a means to diversify their portfolio, but they're also using trafficking victims, labor trafficking, to mule the dope across the border by foot. And then some of them are being set up in houses in various neighborhoods to sell the dope that they move up as a means of working off their debt. And so it's kind of a double sword there. Plus, it just stands to reason that those routes that you would use to move your contraband drugs across the border would work just as well for people. And once again, we are finding that the drug addiction is actually subsequent to being forced into prostitution. And that, much like Norma said, when your very existence is so horrific that your only coping mechanism is to become numb, well, drugs are going to be part and parcel to it.
Kevin, do you want to add, or?
You know, I don't have much to add. I agree with the points made by both speakers. Okay.
We have another question from Paul about interstate cooperation. If you have cases, a trafficking ring across state borders, multiple members in different states, how does that work? Does that automatically become a federal case, or are there ways that states can work together to go after a trafficking network that is across state lines?
Well, Kevin Koliner here. There's a number of federal resources, of course, that could be brought to bear on a case like that. And not knowing the details, I guess my assumption is that it certainly could be worked with state cooperatives as well as with the federal law enforcement community. You know, generally speaking, federal venue lies wherever acts are perpetrated, where the perpetrators live and work, or where victims were victimized. So, you know, we have venue is fairly broad, generally speaking, for federal statutes, meaning where a case can be brought. Now, in terms of a truly multi-state organization, it is true that U.S. attorneys' offices have our own districts and divisions, but of course we have the Maine Department of Justice, and we have many dedicated professionals within the Department of Justice who devote their careers to this very issue. So within the Civil Rights Division, there is a human trafficking group. Within the Child Exploitation Division of the Criminal Division, there are professionals, lawyers there, prosecutors who deal with human trafficking issues as it relates to children. I guess that would be my recommendation if you have a case that you believe is truly multi-state in nature and that there's no clear venue. I guess the first calls that I would make would be to the Civil Rights Division and to the Child Exploitation Division.
Thank you. Kevin, you might be able to answer this question also from Maynard. There have been a couple of questions about the scope of the problem and how large a problem sex trafficking is in the United States relative to the rest of the world, and we're just interested in the larger international problem. But if you have any sort of data that you could share with us about sex and labor trafficking, if that's possible.
Well, I don't have any statistics to offer. I know that there are statistics that are bandied about. There are statistics that are talked about in detail with various different countries in the State Department's Trafficking of Persons report that comes out every year. That can be accessed online. It's an excellent report that talks about worldwide trafficking of persons issues. I'll say this, every time that I've read statistics on this issue, there are always admittedly very wide margins of error and large caveats that are made before any statistics are offered, because this is a crime that occurs in the shadows. It's one of those crimes where the victims are almost as unlikely to come forward as the perpetrators. It makes it very, very hard to quantify, especially when so many victims of this crime are foreign nationals and their very status in this country is in some legal jeopardy. They are the last people to come forward. It makes it that of course makes a huge opportunity for traffickers. It's an unfortunate reality, though, that it's very difficult to quantify. I'll say this.
Well,
when I started the prosecution against Brandon Thompson and he was using Backpage.com and we found these ads, I perhaps arrogantly thought, as soon as the first news hit the press, I thought, well, this is fantastic. I mean, Backpage.com is going to shut down in South Dakota, because who would be stupid enough to post erotic services ads when there's a newspaper article and a report on the local news talking about a potential life in prison sentence for doing this. I can tell you right now, a month after Brandon Thompson received life in prison for this, I could go on Backpage.com and probably pull up 15 of those ads posted in the last 24 hours in my community alone. So it is something that is very prevalent.
Norma, did you want to jump in?
Yes, there are some very obvious factors now that we know will increase the likelihood of sex trafficking and labor trafficking, particularly on the sex trafficking side. If you live in a country that has legalized prostitution, you are going to have a greater incidence of sex trafficking. So countries like Germany, for instance, and all the other countries that have legalized prostitution, you are going to have that central core of legalized prostitution, and then you're going to have a huge ring of sex trafficking of the illegal commercial sexual exploitation that will surround it. And so the countries that have taken a principled stand against commercial sexual exploitation, like the Nordic countries, for instance, Sweden originated the world's first human rights, women's rights inspired legal approach to prostitution, which is now known as the Nordic model. And so the countries that have adopted that legal approach, and I'm talking, of course, of Sweden, Norway, South Korea, and Iceland, the countries that have adopted this approach, which criminalizes the buyers of sexual exploitation, commercial sexual exploitation, and treat the prostituted human beings as, they give them an exit strategy. Those countries have lower incidences, dramatically actually lower incidences of sex trafficking. Those countries also have what I talked to about earlier, a greater social safety net. Those countries have made a conscious decision to work in a very principled way against poverty in their countries. So that's what you look for to see which countries will have greater incidences. And where there have been countries where there's natural catastrophes like Haiti and great poverty, and gender inequality, those measures, gender inequality being key, you're going to have greater, and plus military, lots of military conflicts will increase the incidences of sex trafficking. So those factors are very reliable measures to gauge whether or not you have high incidences of human trafficking.
Thank you, Norma. We have another question for you. It's from Laura. And I will read her question. It was mentioned that males are socialized in a way that makes the buying of sex acceptable. And she wants to know, she also comments, in our society it seems as though we basically have just come to accept men as naturally being more sexually inclined, and therefore a lot of women view the buying of sex and sexual services by men as okay. Does your organization reach out to women in an effort to change this perspective?
Well, this speaks to what I spoke about earlier, which is the cultural conditions and the social conditions that are hospitable to commercial sexual exploitation, and they do impact each gender differently. But make no mistake about it, the sex industry has invested a huge amount of resources into expanding the market with which they can sell this idea of the commodification of human sexuality, because that's what we're talking about, taking human beings, most specifically women and girls, reducing them to a thing that can be bought and sold for sexual use and abuse. And women are targeted for very often, we have to be very honest and clear about this, through mainstream women's publications have been guilty of this, of sending out messages to women that their self-worth and their value is their body and what they look like, and most especially their sexual availability. So women are socialized around accepting this to some degree as well. There's no question about that. And the pornography industry wants them to be consumers. And once you get women to agree to consuming, and I have a slide in my PowerPoint that shows Rihanna getting for her 21st birthday a lap dance. Once you get women to collaborate with this very destructive notion of buying and selling women for sex, we've reached a very dangerous place in our culture, because what we've done is we've then moved women away from our very own best interests, and because we know that men and boys are being socialized in a way, and this is what being an international organization, which has been very painful to see, that men and boys all over the world, regardless of race, class, culture, are being socialized in the same way to destroy women and girls through sex. And this is an enormous thing that we have to challenge. We have to challenge the cultural forces that are normalizing this enormously destructive behavior being done through gender, being done through taking male sexuality, twisting it in a way that's highly destructive of women and girls. And that's why I say that men have to take their sexuality back from the pornographers.
Thank you.
If I may,
go ahead.
If I may, what you are in effect doing with shows like Cat House and others out there is you are grooming your young, impressionable folks in much the same manner that a child predator would for the end purpose of having sex with that child. You are normalizing overtly sexual behavior. You are deliberately breaking down the moral inhibitors that may be installed by family or church or whoever, or society, and you are substituting your overtly sexual mores for that of the child. And it starts very, very young. And when you look at it strictly from the standpoint of what are we doing to our young, what does that then cause us to do to each other, it's like, clearly, it is grooming practice as if it were right out of the pedophile's handbook.
We have a question from Nicole. Are any of you all aware of any published best practice guides that focus on victim-centered approaches to prosecuting human trafficking cases, whether it be labor or sex trafficking, that you make available to prosecutors and to other law enforcement officials? Maybe Sergeant Bray or Kevin?
Well, Kevin Koliner here. I'm not aware of anything that's out there that's published. I'm sure there probably are some things. I can tell you some of the outreach that I do and that some of the law enforcement folks that I've worked with on these cases do. I mean, I do my best to go out and try to talk with who I think of as kind of first responders in the local trafficking world. And what I mean by that is I just talked to a group of workers from the juvenile detention centers from the state of South Dakota, because I know from the Thompson case that many of these girls came through the juvenile detention system. And so we gave a talk to them about the best practices if you have a girl who starts talking about these things. I've talked to groups of annual meetings of corrections associations because, again, oftentimes victims of these crimes, for right or for wrong, come into the system through the criminal justice system as defendants at first. And so I think it requires a lot of awareness, eye-opening awareness to change the mindset that sometimes it's easy as a law enforcement professional to think of all defendants as people who make dumb decisions, and then their decisions are just dumb decisions that defendants make. We have to, as law enforcement professionals, think about this category of victims as potentially they come in as defendants, but these are decisions they've made against their will, and so we need to think about them as victims. So I do my best to try to get out and make those speeches to certain groups. I don't know if there's any published materials out there on that, but that's what we try to stress, sort of this victim-oriented approach.
This is Chris. I try to do the same thing from the standpoint of best practices are so varied based on local law, based on an agency's either prosecutorial or police, what their policies and procedures are on reporting runaway juveniles, reporting prostitution incidents. Do they even look at prostitution as a crime? Some of it's given a real pass as far as either victim, provider, or consumer. So best practices is kind of like a regional specialty, I guess. We have, in Phoenix, we have talked with our juvenile detention officers. We've talked with our juvenile probation officers. We have talked with some schools, although the schools are still reluctant to address the problem. But best practices to make people aware, and then go to those folks that have accepted this as a specialty and ask those specific questions, because there's just such a wide variety of variables. And much like Kevin said about the victim may come into the system in a variety of ways. Many times that chronic runaway is running away from something and is being involved in survival sex, which is in a gateway into being prostituted. So best practices, wow. I don't know that there is anything published per se.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully we'll be seeing things like that in the very near future. I think this might be our last question, and Norma, I think maybe you would be best to answer this, but again, anyone can jump in. This follow-up on something that Kevin mentioned about training program or prevention programs in juvenile detention facilities. Question from Tiffany is, are there any efforts being made to conduct prevention education in the schools or in juvenile detention facilities or other places where we might see people who are vulnerable to getting into this business, to bring awareness to the problem? Anything that you've seen on a more widespread basis going on here?
Well, you know, I think we're all aware of the tremendous resistance that any kind of education around sexuality is always met with in the United States. And this is going to prove to be a huge barrier of getting the kind of education that we need around this issue, because it involves sexuality on the sex trafficking side. And yet, that is an important solution, a very critical solution in helping children become less vulnerable to sex trafficking, is to get real equality-based, equality-premised sex education into the schools. And yet, any effort I'm aware of to do that is constantly met with resistance from a range of groups. And until we're able to overcome that resistance, I suspect we're going to have a hard time getting programs. So to answer your question, no, I am not aware of any mass-based education going on in the school system. Do we need to have that happen? We absolutely do. We need to, part of that curriculum needs to include Grand Theft Auto, which is the world's biggest selling computer game that reaches children and is about victimizing, murdering prostituted women. There are so many horrendous games out there being marketed to children that are vehicles for, again, socializing male sexuality in hugely misogynistic ways. The average age of exposure of children now to pornography. I've seen Gail Dines, the author of Pornland, a book I recommend everyone reading. Gail Dines has sent out a study that she came across that shows the average exposure of children to pornography now, I think, is something like 8 or 11. So, no, we don't have it but we sure do need a gender equality-based sex education throughout the nation.
If I could, this is Chris. In Arizona, the Girl Scouts have taken on this issue. And we have a conference annually here called The Girls' World is Different. And part of that program addresses sex trafficking, human trafficking in all of its forms. What can you do? Internet safety has been part of the vehicle to get us into those classes and to present to the Girl Scout leadership. And I was really pretty surprised that they took it on, but boy, have they. They've done great work.
Kevin, your last word?
No,
okay.
I don't really have much more to add. I have done presentations in schools, but I agree with what Norma says. Whenever you start talking about sex, you run up against all sorts of issues. My newest idea is to try to come up with some sort of a presentation. Here, I started by saying no, and now I'm talking now for a few minutes. Sorry. My newest idea has been to try to come up with some sort of a presentation to give to teachers and guidance counselors. There are various in-service days that public schools have where teachers have training, and I'd like to find a way to get on that docket to talk about sex trafficking, just in order so they have some information if they see some signs and symptoms among their classes. But Norma's point is unfortunately spot on. Whenever you stand up and talk to kids, and the three-letter word sex comes out of your mouth, you're in hot water. So.
Okay, thank you. So we were actually just past 4 o'clock. So Norma or Chris, do you want to any last words? And Kevin, you as well. If you want to, this is like so we're wrapping up. So anything you want to add?
Well, I would just add to what was just said, the irony in all of this is that children are getting a sex education, aren't they? And they're getting it through the pornographers. So we as a society are going to have to make a decision as to who is going to socialize human sexuality to this population. Is it going to be the pornography industry, which it currently is, or are we going to offer sex education in the school system that will give young people a chance to form sexual lives that will not move them in a direction of violence and humiliation and abuse. We are living in a sea. The rate of sexual abuse in this country. Often the State Department sends international visitors to CATW, and I often ask the guests what the rate of sexual abuse is in their country. Interestingly enough, the men usually don't know, but the women guests always seem to know what the rate of sexual abuse is in the country. And in the United States, we have an incredibly high record of sexual abuse of children. Where is the political movement addressing that? This is highly political that this is going on, and yet it continues, and all we're doing is creating the next generation of buyers and the exploited.
Thank you, Norma. Anyone else, or should we wrap it up? Okay, okay, go ahead.
I would just say that the group of people that came here for this webinar are obviously informed. The questions are great. The fact that they're paying attention is outstanding. What I would like for them to take away from this is, as they spread the word, impress on the people they talk to that how can you in good conscience look away from the problem once you know it exists? This is too big a thing to ignore.
Thank you. Well, we've come to the end. We're past 4 o'clock. We actually do have a number of questions that we didn't get to. We apologize for that, but we hope that the questions that we did get to, that we answered them, and we really thank you all for participating to all 3 of our guests, but also everyone from wherever you've been listening in. I will now turn it over to Christina to get some final words. And about where you might be able to get an archived version of the webinar. Or Jim, do you want to go with that?
Sure, I can comment on that. So just a reminder that we are recording today's session, and that will become available on the Government Innovators Network website in 2 to 3 business days, along with the presenters' slide presentations, pending their permission. I want to call up my desktop right now just so you can see. Most of you are probably familiar with our event page by now because I imagine you came here to log in. And you'll notice that there's I'm going to send a link once the recording is posted to a page that'll look similar to this, and that's where the slides and recording will appear. So just stand by with at your emails, and you'll get a note about that. But I also wanted to just point out that we also have this list of useful resource links. Some of these were referenced during today's event, but they're all relevant and important resources that you should be aware of, and we may be adding to this over the next few days as well. So in the meantime, there's that, and I'll be in touch in a few days once the recording is posted, and thanks everyone for attending.
Okay. Thank you, Kevin Koliner. Thank you, Chris Bray, and thank you, Norma Ramos.
Thank you. Thank all of you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate
Thank you, everyone.
We all learned a lot. Thank you very much.